Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 3 of A Climber's Mind. I'm Matt Wright. I'm an outdoor performance coach and a dedicated rock climber. In this episode, I'm going to talk about diagnosis. Diagnosis is a process of figuring out what's really holding a climber back. Very often, the thing that feels like the problem isn't actually the problem, and until you understand that, it's hard to make meaningful progress. Some of the ideas that I'll talk about here can sound a little abstract at first, but they've consistently helped both my clients and my own climbing. That's a big part of why I wanted to share them so publicly, and also give people a sense of how I think before they ever consider working with me as a coach. Around 10 years ago, I had my first proper project. It was a 7A plus called Pleasant Valley Sunday at a sandstone quarry in South Wales called The Gap. It was spring, maybe early summer. The heather hadn't quite come into bloom yet, but I could still remember the contrast of the deep green hillsides against the orange rock. The place still brings back nostalgia for me. It reminds me of how much I had to learn and how little I understood at the time. I've been climbing for less than 6 months, and I probably had around 4 to 6 sessions on the route over a few weeks. The crux involved a small left-hand Gaston crimp, then rolling over with the right hand to a good holdout left. I remember sitting on the rope at the crux, convinced the problem was strength. In my head it felt obvious, I just needed to be stronger. Surely more strength would help. What I didn't realise at the time, but I can clearly see now, was that I was already beginning to observe. I was sensing that there was something more going on than just strength. I found a video of another local climber trying the moves, and something stood out immediately. His footwork was deliberate. The way he rotated and shifted his weight, it looked planned, not reactive. A few days earlier, a visiting climber watched us trying it and said very directly that our hips were just hanging out in space. I'm pretty sure his exact words were actually that our arses were hanging out. And he was right. So I decided to copy the exact footwork from the video. I sat beneath the root and I studied it carefully. I watched the sequence again and again, and I identified all the features on the wall and visualised the movement until I knew, move by move, exactly what I had to do. When it was my turn, I dogged back up to the crux, marked the footholds I needed, chalked up and prepared properly, and suddenly it all felt different. The movement felt intuitive, deliberate. I no longer felt like I was reacting blindly or guessing my way through it. All I had to focus on was the balance point of each move. And from there, my body seemed to roll naturally into the handholds. I remember my climbing partner at the time, Lewis Edwards, shouting up something like, "Good effort, mate!" He was always really encouraging, and I remember feeling genuinely happy. Not just because I nearly did it, but because for the first time I felt like I actually learned something. I went home, and I kept watching the video that evening, replaying the sequence in my head, and I'm pretty sure I sent it on the next session. Looking back, I think that was one of my first lessons in diagnosis. At first, I thought the problem was strength, but the breakthrough came from observation, planning, and better movements. Strength might have helped, but that wasn't the thing that unlocked the sequence. Understanding was. And that really is what this episode is about. I want to talk about diagnosis and how to tell the difference between the obvious symptom and the deeper cause, and why that matters so much if you want to improve. A lot of climbers think diagnosis is just about spotting the obvious weakness. They think, my fingers are weak, or my endurance isn't good enough, or my technique needs work. And sometimes that's true, but very often those things are only the surface of the problem. A climber might look like they have weak fingers, for example, but that weakness might not just be a pure, raw physical limitation. It could come from inconsistency in training. It could come from not understanding how to train effectively. It could come from missing important detail that matters when trying to express strength on rock. So the symptom is physical, but the deeper cause may be something in the background. And that is what makes diagnosis difficult. If you only react to what you can immediately see, you often miss the real issue. You end up trying to solve the wrong problem. For me, diagnosis begins when you stop reacting to symptoms and start looking for patterns, because every climbing or training experience contains information, but only if you know how to observe it. Every session, every route, every boulder, every hesitation, every success, every mistake, every time you execute well, and every time you don't. All of it contains information, but that information is only useful if you can step back, observe it clearly, and interpret it honestly. So a huge part of getting better is becoming more aware of patterns. Patterns in your movement, patterns in your preparation, patterns in your decisions, patterns in how you respond to pressure, fatigue, fear, or uncertainty. Once you start to notice these patterns, you can explore your performance more deeply. Climbing becomes a feedback cycle where experience gives you information, and the information allows you to interpret, adapt, and grow. Diagnosis is not a fixed conclusion. It's an ongoing conversation between your judgment, your practice, and the feedback you get. If the process is honest and consistent, but nothing meaningful is improving, that may be a sign that your diagnosis needs updating. Being good at diagnosis really comes down to observation. It means learning to understand yourself and the environment around you by paying close attention, because the more attention you pay, the more clarity you gain, and with more clarity comes better understanding. An observation needs some structure. These are the kinds of questions I think you should be asking yourself. What happens just before a failure? What am I doing that others do differently? Is my process consistent or reactive? Is there something deeper here that I'm not understanding yet? Are there patterns outside of my climbing affecting how I behave inside of climbing? That last one matters more than people think. Patterns of frustration, poor patience, anxiety, over-controlling, and rushing. If those habits exist outside of climbing, you should not expect them to just disappear the moment you start climbing. They usually come with you. I also think it's important to understand that not everything I say or every other coach says will work for everybody. We are all different. We learn differently, respond differently, and bring different strengths and limitations to the table. So it's important to stay open-minded, but also a little skeptical. You have to think carefully about what you read, what you hear, and what you're told, rather than just accepting everything blindly. Because if you follow everything you hear blindly, you'll very quickly run into other sources that completely contradict it. That is one of the realities of climbing performance. It isn't an exact science, and there are often multiple ways to solve the same problem. That's why it's so important to diagnose the problem well first, then commit to a process and give it time to work. For most intermediate and advanced climbers, meaningful progress usually takes at least 6 to 12 weeks of deep, consistent practice. But that time can be wasted entirely if you're practicing the wrong limitation. And that's one of the big challenges now. There is so much information online. You read one thing, then immediately find several other sources saying the opposite. So how do you know what to trust? My first piece of advice would be this: improve your own judgment. Because if you don't, you can get pulled from one idea to the next without ever being consistent long enough to find what actually works. At some point, you need to trust either your own process or your coach's process enough to stay poised, patient, and consistent with it. Many climbers also misdiagnose through ego. Strength is easier to admit. It sounds tougher. It can sound easier to say, "I need more power," than to admit your execution is poor, or that fear and pressure are distorting your performance. In other words, we often choose the explanation that protects our identity best, and we all do that. A novice climber often climbs with huge amounts of noise. Their movement is indecisive, their preparation is inconsistent, their rest is inconsistent, their focus narrows down to just doing the next move or not slipping, no matter the cost. There is effort, but not always much understanding behind that effort. So how do you move from being a novice climber full of noise to becoming someone who understands themselves, understands their environment, and can practice deeply? You learn to become an observer. You slow down. You stop reacting so quickly. You look at the route, the problem, or the limitation from the widest lens possible and ask yourself, what is really going on? You think about other climbers with similar problems and then ask yourself honestly whether you repeat those same patterns too. And once you can see the patterns, you ask how you can tweak it so that your next effort improves the process. That, to me, is what deep practice really is. There's a famous line from Samuel Beckett. Ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. I think that fits climbing perfectly. You need to care enough to pay attention, but not too much. That failure becomes personal and frustration takes over. The process is to try, fail, analyse, adjust, then fail better. And that is eventually what leads to success. But really, success is not the most important thing. Failure is. Because failure is what gives you information. Failure is what shows you the gap. Failure is what gives you something to study, to understand and refine. If you can learn to use failure well, it stops being just a setback and starts becoming part of the path forward. Another important part of diagnosis is understanding that there is only real value in identifying and working on your limitations when these limitations are actually relevant to your goals. Weakness only matters in context. If your goals are steep overhanging roots or roofs, then spending loads of time focusing on weaknesses on tiny holds and slabs is probably not going to move the needle in the way that matters most. And sometimes the issue is not physical, technical, or even deeply psychological. Sometimes it's tactical. You're strong enough, but you rush the rests, waste energy with poor decisions, or keep trying in the wrong way or the wrong time. That is still part of diagnosis too. And I learned another version of all this on my first 8B plus boulder, Serendipity. At the time, I was working with a coach and followed a training plan, but I kept doing something that probably would have looked a bit irrational from the outside. I'd often skip my midweek training sessions to drive out to the peak and get on the climb instead. I remember telling him about it, and I had the sense that he was a little bit surprised, maybe disappointed that I wasn't sticking to the training more closely. Looking back, I understand that completely. Training needs consistency if it's going to work properly. So if that's what he was thinking, he was probably right. But something interesting happened. Even though I wasn't following the plan perfectly, I still climbed the problem, and what I did in that moment worked. Why is that? Because somewhere in me, I knew that familiarity mattered. I knew that repeatedly trying the moves was not just teaching me about the climb, it was also building the exact kind of strength and understanding that the climb itself demanded. I'd already done the stand start, Serenity, which was my first 8B. That took about 8 sessions, and it taught me a really important lesson. Just because you can't do the moves right now doesn't mean you won't be able to do them. I can still remember those early sessions. For the first 3 sessions, I could barely even pull on the start holds, and I couldn't stick the first move. That was it. I'd drive 2 hours, sometimes after work, sometimes on a dry weekend day, walking through the woods with low mist hanging in the trees and shafts of sunlight coming through. And I'd go and throw myself at a move I couldn't even really start. If I'm honest, it felt surreal because in my head, 8B was something only really strong climbers did. And I didn't think of myself as one of those climbers. Yeah, I could sport climb hard, but 8B boulder was on a level of strength that I didn't think I had. I think a lot of people would have given up after the first session, maybe even after the first few. If you can't pull on to the start holds, it's very easy to conclude that the answer is obvious. Come back when you're stronger. But that wasn't really how I saw it. What mattered to me was that there was still information there. There was still something to observe, still something to learn. So I kept turning up because I didn't feel like I'd run out of lessons yet. By the time I'd started trying Serendipity, the sit start, I already had a lot of familiarity with the stand start and with the style of the climbing. I had this strong intuition. I could do it if I just kept trying it enough. Not in a blind, stubborn way, more that I could feel the climb was teachable. I could have ignored that intuition and just followed the training plan more strictly. And maybe that would have worked too. But honestly, I don't think I would have climbed it that way. I don't think I would have built the level of familiarity that I needed, or developed the very specific strength the problem required from me. That's not to say my coach was wrong. Far from it. He was far more experienced than I was then. And the point isn't that coaching or training is wrong. The point is that in the moment, I knew what I needed more of. And what I needed was contact with the climb. At the time, the symptom was obvious. I felt weak. On a climb like Serendipity, it would have been very easy to say, I'm just not strong enough. But looking back, that can't really have been the true limitation, because I did the climb. And if I was able to do it, then raw physical capacity wasn't the main thing holding me back in the way that I first thought. The bigger need was familiarity. It was understanding. It was specific contact with the problem and enough time spent learning the exact language of that climb. In that moment, following the training plan more strictly might have actually made things worse rather than better. It may have added fatigue, reduced the quality of my attempts, and taken time away from the thing that was actually helping me most. So the answer wasn't more training. The answer was familiarity. Serendipity is at a crag called Impossible Roof, and it's called that for a reason. It's incredibly steep. There's next to no holds. The holds that are there are tiny ripples, little blobs of texture, very specific features that demand a very specific kind of strength and tension. It's not the sort of climb where you can just turn up generally stronger and expect everything to fall into place. It asks you to learn its language, and I think that's what drew me to it so deeply. People might assume I was motivated mainly by the grade, and of course that meant something. It was a beautiful line, and I really wanted to do it, but what pulled me in more than anything was the complexity of it, the intricacy, the fact that it demanded such high levels of strength, body tension, accuracy and commitment, all in a style that felt beyond me at the time. Because deep down, I never felt like raw strength was my biggest asset. So for me, the climb became a lesson in something else. The power of attention, repetition, and specific familiarity. It taught me that sometimes the answer is not to step away from the climb and solve the problem in the abstract. Sometimes the climb itself is the teacher. Sometimes repeatedly returning to the same sequence with enough patience and enough honesty builds exactly the understanding and exactly the strength you need. From the outside, it might have looked like I needed more training consistency. And maybe in one sense I did. But on a deeper level, what I needed most was more time in contact with the problem itself. That was the thing that moved the needle. So, good diagnosis is not just about finding weaknesses. It's about finding the weaknesses that matter the most for the goals you care about and understanding what that specific goal is actually asking from you. Because otherwise, you end up trying to improve everything at once. And that is what most climbers do. They train a bit of endurance, a bit of strength, a bit of power, a bit of technique, a bit of mindset work, all at the same time, and no real intention behind it. Their approach becomes a mess, busy but not effective. For me, strength, lifestyle, movement, and psychology form the foundation for almost any climbing goal. If the foundation is not solid, that is usually where the work needs to begin. Your lifestyle has to support recovery and consistency. Your strength has to be good enough for the demands of the goal. Your movement has to be efficient, and psychologically, you need clear goals, clear decision making, and enough trust in the process to stay consistent. Because if your goals are unclear, you don't really have direction. If your execution is poor, you'll lack consistency. And if your lifestyle does not support recovery, everything becomes harder than it needs to be. So before you ask what to train next, it makes sense to ask, is the foundation solid? Am I reacting to symptoms, or am I actually understanding the problem? Because climbing is a deeply complicated sport. There are many layers to it. Physical, technical, tactical, psychological, and lifestyle based. And those layers need to be organised if you want to perform well. You cannot diagnose what you do not understand, And if you want to improve, you have to learn to see more clearly. Even after 10 years of climbing and completing some of the hardest climbs in the country, I still feel like I'm only scratching the surface. I'm always learning. I still try to maintain that beginner's mindset, because in the end, the climbers who improve best are often not the ones who try the hardest. They're the ones who learn to pay attention. Thanks for listening to episode 3 of A Climber's Mind. I really appreciate you being here. And if there's any topic you'd like to explore in the future, please feel free to let me know.